The crowd was electric, the cheers deafening, and Captain Elias Rourke wanted to be anywhere but here. Standing under the glaring spotlights of the Unity Dome, the largest arena in New Chicago, he adjusted his stiff dress uniform collar and squinted at the stage below. An announcer's voice boomed through the air, describing the historic unveiling of humanity's greatest innovation in warfare. Rourke had his doubts. "Ladies and gentlemen, the future of global security," the announcer bellowed, and a trio of hulking figures emerged from behind shimmering curtains. The audience gasped as the so-called dinosaur warriors strode into view. Each of them towered over 7 feet tall, with muscles bulging beneath their camouflaged combat suits. Their faces still held the faint echoes of human features, but sharp ridges and reptilian slits for eyes betrayed their genetic alterations. Rourke couldn't help but snort. "Future of global security, huh? They can't even walk without looking like they just learned how," he muttered to the officer beside him. Sure enough, one of the warriors stumbled slightly, earning a murmur of concern from the crowd. The announcer glossed over it. "Each of these enhanced soldiers is equipped with the strength of a T-Rex, the speed of a velociraptor, and the resilience of a stegosaurus. A triumph of science and humanity." The warriors lined up stiffly as the lead scientist, Dr. Marina Voss, took the stage. She was all charisma, a vision of sleek professionalism in her white lab coat. Her speech was full of lofty ideals: ending wars faster, reducing human casualties, ensuring peace through superior firepower. But as Rourke listened, he couldn't shake the nagging feeling that it was all wrong. The first sign of trouble came during the demonstration. One of the warriors stepped forward to display their enhanced reflexes by deflecting a series of incoming projectiles. The first few passes were impressive, a blur of motion as the warrior snatched objects mid-air. But then, something shifted. A projectile grazed the warrior's cheek, and the soldier froze. His nostrils flared, his body tensed, and then he let out a guttural roar that reverberated through the arena. The crowd recoiled as he lunged toward the nearest spectator. The chaos was immediate. Security swarmed the stage, tranquilizers fired, and the warrior collapsed in a heap. Dr. Voss waved her arms, shouting about a minor glitch, but the damage was done. The crowd's enthusiasm turned to unease, whispers of doubt spreading like wildfire. Rourke shook his head. "Great sales pitch, Doc," he muttered. The officer beside him didn't reply, too busy watching the cleanup effort with wide eyes. 2 days later, Rourke found himself reluctantly boarding a transport headed for Argent Base. Nestled deep in the Rockies, the base was where the Dinosaur Warrior project had been developed in secrecy over the past decade. Rourke's orders were clear: assess the program and determine if it was salvageable after the debacle at the Unity Dome. He wasn't thrilled about the assignment. Babysitting gene-spliced super soldiers wasn't his idea of military service. The flight was uneventful, and as the transport descended into the valley, Rourke caught his first glimpse of the base. It was a sprawling complex of reinforced buildings, surrounded by electrified fences and automated turrets. He disembarked and was met by a stern-faced lieutenant who escorted him to the command center. Dr. Voss was waiting for him, her polished demeanor intact despite the recent controversy. "Captain Rourke," she greeted him with a tight smile. "I trust your flight was comfortable?" "About as comfortable as a seat in the 5th row of a public execution," he replied dryly. Her smile faltered, but she quickly recovered. "We're under scrutiny, yes, but the project's merits speak for themselves," she said, leading him through the labyrinthine halls. "I'm confident that once you see the warriors in action, you'll understand their potential." They entered a viewing room overlooking a training arena. Below, a squad of dinosaur warriors was engaged in combat drills. The display was undeniably impressive. Warriors leaped impossibly high, their claws tearing through simulated targets with ease. One of them ripped a steel door off its hinges as if it were made of cardboard. "They're stronger, faster, and more resilient than any human soldier," Voss said, her voice tinged with pride. "Imagine what they could do on the battlefield." Rourke watched silently, his arms crossed. And what about their little episodes? He asked. That guy at the dome didn't look too stable. Voss hesitated. Adjusting to the genetic modifications can be challenging, she admitted. But we're refining the process. Incidents like that are rare. Rare doesn't cut it when you're asking me to endorse this, Rourke shot back. I need to know these soldiers won't turn on their own team. Before she could respond, an alarm blared. In the arena below, one of the warriors had thrown a fellow soldier against the wall and was snarling, teeth bared. Trainers rushed in, firing tranquilizers, but the scene was eerily similar to what had happened at the Unity Dome. Rourke turned to Voss, his expression grim. Rare, huh? He said. The incident in the arena set the tone for Rourke's first week at Argent Base. He was assigned to shadow Sergeant Kane, one of the senior modified warriors, to get a first-hand look at their capabilities. Kane was a towering figure with sharp features and a demeanor that oscillated between stoic and volatile. He was one of the most stable subjects, according to Voss, though Rourke wasn't sure if that was comforting or concerning. Their first mission together was a simulated urban assault. Rourke observed from a safe distance as Kane and his squad cleared a mock village, demonstrating their speed and precision. It was hard not to be impressed. Kane moved like a predator, his every step calculated, his strikes devastating. But there was an undercurrent of something primal in his movements, a barely restrained aggression that put Rourke on edge. The mission took a darker turn when the squad encountered an unarmed civilian target, a test to assess their judgment in non-combat scenarios. The other warriors hesitated, but Kane didn't. He lunged, his claws slashing through the target with brutal efficiency. Rourke called for an immediate halt to the exercise, his voice echoing through the comms. He confronted Kane afterward, demanding an explanation. Kane shrugged, his reptilian eyes narrowing. They told us to neutralize threats, he said. What's the problem? The problem, Rourke snapped, is that you're supposed to know the difference between a threat and a scared civilian. Kane's expression darkened. They didn't splice me up so I could hesitate, he said, his voice low and dangerous. They made us to kill. That night, Rourke reviewed the program's classified records. What he found only deepened his unease. Reports of erratic behavior, escalating aggression, and psychological breakdowns were scattered throughout the logs. In one file, a warrior had attacked his own squad during a live mission, resulting in multiple casualties. The incident had been buried, the details sanitized to protect the project's reputation. Rourke confronted Voss the next morning. He slammed the reports onto her desk, his voice tight with anger. You knew this was a ticking time bomb, and you let it keep ticking. Voss didn't deny it. Instead, she leaned back in her chair, her expression unreadable. This project is bigger than you or me, Captain, she said. We're fighting a war we can't afford to lose. The warriors are imperfect, yes, but they're our best shot at survival. At what cost? Rourke demanded. She didn't answer. Instead, she handed him a folder containing his next assignment: lead a team to recover Kane and several others who had gone AWOL the previous night. Rourke stared at her, incredulous. You're kidding, he said. You want me to track down a pack of super soldiers who are already losing their grip on reality? You're the best we've got, Voss said simply. Rourke didn't argue. He didn't have a choice. The forest was darker than Rourke anticipated. Night had draped the dense pines in a suffocating black, and the moonlight struggled to pierce the canopy above. His squad moved in silence, their boots crunching softly on the frozen ground. They were armed to the teeth, tranquilizers, electric nets, and enough firepower to take down a tank, but Rourke couldn't shake the feeling that none of it would be enough if things went south. Eyes up, he muttered into his comms. Kane's smart. If he wants us dead, he'll see us coming before we see him. Comforting, Corporal Diaz whispered back, her voice thick with sarcasm. She was a crack shot with a reputation for keeping her cool under pressure, but even she sounded uneasy. Remind me why we didn't just bomb the area? Because the brass wants them back alive, Rourke said. Or what's left of them. The team pushed forward, weaving through the underbrush. They were tracking a faint heat signature picked up by the drones earlier that evening. It was likely Kane and his squad, but the forest had a way of distorting signals. Rourke had been in enough ops to know that nothing about this felt right. Movement at 2 o'clock, Diaz whispered sharply. Rourke held up a fist, signaling the squad to halt. He crouched, peering into the darkness. For a moment, there was nothing but the rustle of wind through the trees. Then he saw it, a shadow, too large to be an animal, darting between the trunks. "Confirm visual," he said. "Negative," came the reply from another soldier. Rourke clenched his jaw. "Stay sharp. They're testing us." The shadow reappeared, closer this time. Rourke caught a glint of something, a claw, maybe, or a flash of scaled skin, before it vanished again. His gut told him this was no ordinary recon mission. Kane and his crew weren't just hiding, they were hunting. A low growl rumbled through the trees, and Rourke's blood ran cold. It was followed by another, then another, until the forest seemed alive with the sound. His comms crackled with overlapping voices as his squad scrambled to identify the source. "They're surrounding us," Diaz hissed. "Permission to engage?" "Hold your fire," Rourke ordered. He didn't want to spook them, not yet. He reached for the tranquilizer rifle slung over his shoulder, keeping his movements slow and deliberate. The growls grew louder, closer, and Rourke could feel the weight of unseen eyes watching him. And then, all at once, they attacked. Kane came from the left, a blur of motion that took down one of Rourke's men before anyone could react. Another warrior, a female with jagged ridges along her forearms, lunged from the right, her claws slicing through the air. Rourke dove to the ground, rolling to avoid her strike. He came up firing, the tranquilizer dart embedding itself in her shoulder. She roared in pain but didn't go down. "Light 'em up." Rourke shouted. The forest exploded with gunfire and flashing lights as the squad opened up. Diaz nailed another warrior with an electric net, the wires crackling as they tightened around the thrashing figure. But the fight was chaos. The modified soldiers moved too fast, their reflexes too sharp. One by one, Rourke's men were taken down, disarmed, incapacitated, or worse. Rourke found himself face to face with Kane. The sergeant loomed over him, his eyes glowing faintly in the dark. For a moment, neither of them moved. Then Kane spoke, his voice guttural and low. "You shouldn't have come." Rourke didn't hesitate. He raised his rifle and fired. The dart hit Kane square in the chest, but he didn't even flinch. With a snarl, Kane grabbed the weapon and snapped it in half, tossing the pieces aside. "You're out of your depth, Captain," he said, his lips curling into something between a sneer and a snarl. "Go back and tell them we're done being their puppets." Rourke barely had time to process the words before Kane lashed out, sending him sprawling. His head hit the ground hard, and the world spun. He tried to get up, but Kane was already gone, disappearing into the forest with his squad. When Rourke came to, the forest was quiet. He groaned, pushing himself into a sitting position. His comms were dead, his gear scattered around him. He counted the bodies of his men, some unconscious, others motionless. Diaz was slumped against a tree, blood trickling from a gash on her forehead. He crawled over to her, shaking her shoulder. "Diaz. Hey. Wake up." She groaned, her eyes fluttering open. What happened?" "Kane happened," Rourke said grimly. "We're pulling out." It took them hours to regroup and make it back to the extraction point. By the time they arrived, dawn was breaking, and the sky was streaked with orange and pink. A transport was waiting for them, along with a medical team. Rourke didn't wait for orders, he stormed straight to the comms room and demanded a secure line to Argent Base. When Dr. Voss's face appeared on the screen, he didn't bother with pleasantries. "You didn't tell me they were this far gone." Voss's expression was unreadable. "What happened?" "They're not just unstable, they're organized." Kane's leading them like a damn warlord. They wiped out half my squad and sent me back with a warning. Voss's lips tightened. I'll dispatch reinforcements. No, Rourke snapped. You need to shut this down. Now. Call in an airstrike, burn the whole forest if you have to. They're too dangerous to leave alive. That's not an option, Voss said coldly. These soldiers represent years of research and billions in funding. Terminating them would set us back decades. Decades of what? Rourke shot back. Creating monsters you can't control? Voss leaned forward, her eyes narrowing. Your job is to recover them, Captain. Not question the program. Rourke stared at her, disgusted. You're playing with fire, and you know it. The screen went dark before he could say anything else. Rourke spent the next 2 days planning. He wasn't about to walk into another ambush, and he wasn't going to let Voss's arrogance get more people killed. If he was going after Kane again, he'd do it on his terms. That he assembled a smaller team, specialists he trusted, and loaded them up with every piece of gear he could requisition. Tranquilizers and nets weren't enough, so he added high-powered explosives and incendiary rounds to the mix. If they couldn't bring Kane in alive, they'd make damn sure he didn't leave the forest alive. As they prepared to deploy, Rourke couldn't shake the nagging sense that something bigger was at play. Kane's words echoed in his mind, "We're done being their puppets." What did he mean? Was it just bitterness over the program, or was there something else Voss wasn't telling him? He didn't have time to dwell on it. The mission was all that mattered now. They hit the forest hard, this time under the cover of night. Drones swept ahead, scanning for heat signatures, while Rourke's team moved in tight formation. The air was heavy with tension, every snap of a twig setting nerves on edge. They found the first signs of Kane's stronghold at dawn: makeshift barricades, crude traps, and traces of blood. The forest had become their battlefield, and Kane was playing to his strengths. The team advanced cautiously, dismantling traps and marking their path. It wasn't long before they reached the heart of the stronghold. It was a cave, carved into the side of a cliff, its entrance guarded by 2 hulking figures. Rourke signaled for his team to hold. They were outnumbered and outmatched, but they had the element of surprise. He motioned to Diaz, who set up a sniper position in the trees, "Take out the guards." Rourke whispered. Diaz nodded, her rifle steady. 2 muffled shots later, the guards were down. Rourke led the charge, his team sweeping into the cave. The interior was a maze of tunnels, dimly lit by flickering torches. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth and something metallic, blood, maybe. The deeper they went, the more they found: makeshift barracks, weapon caches, and evidence of experiments Kane's group had been conducting on themselves. They were evolving, adapting, becoming something even more dangerous. And then they found Kane. He stood at the center of a cavernous chamber, flanked by his remaining warriors. His eyes glowed faintly in the dark, and his claws gleamed in the firelight. He didn't look surprised to see them. "You came back," he said, his voice calm. "I told you to stay away." "You didn't leave me much choice," Rourke replied, raising his weapon. "This ends here." Kane smiled, a cold, predatory smile. "You still don't get it, do you? We're not the monsters. They are." Before Rourke could respond, Kane let out a deafening roar, and the chamber erupted into chaos. The roar reverberated through the cavern, shaking the walls and sending chunks of loose rock tumbling to the ground. Rourke didn't hesitate. He squeezed the trigger, unleashing a burst of suppressive fire aimed directly at Kane. His team followed suit, their weapons lighting up the dark chamber. But Kane and his warriors were too fast. They darted through the shadows, their movements fluid and feral, dodging bullets and closing the distance with terrifying speed. "Fall back!" Rourke shouted, his voice barely audible over the chaos. He threw a flashbang toward the advancing figures and ducked as the chamber exploded in a blinding burst of light. The momentary disorientation gave his team the chance to retreat into one of the side tunnels. their footsteps echoing in the confined space. Rourke glanced over his shoulder as they ran. Kane's silhouette loomed in the smoke, his glowing eyes locked onto them like a predator zeroing in on its prey. Rourke gritted his teeth. They couldn't keep running, not without a plan. In here, he barked, motioning his team into a narrow alcove. They ducked inside, catching their breath as the distant sounds of growls and footsteps echoed closer. Rourke looked at Diaz, who was clutching her rifle like it was the only thing keeping her grounded. "Diaz," he said, his voice low but firm. "Do you still have the C4?" She nodded, fumbling with her pack. "Yeah, but if we blow the entrance, we're trapped in here." "It's not for the entrance," Rourke said grimly. He pointed to the ceiling. "This whole cavern system is unstable. If we time it right, we can bring the whole damn thing down on their heads." Her eyes widened. "You're serious?" "Dead serious," Rourke replied. "We plant the charges, draw them in, and collapse the chamber. It's the only way." "What about us?" another soldier asked, his voice tinged with panic. "We won't make it out in time." "We don't have to," Rourke said. "There's an old secondary shaft about 50 yards back. It's not on their patrol routes. If we move fast, we can slip out before this place comes down." The soldier didn't look convinced, but he nodded anyway. Rourke turned back to Diaz. "Set the charges. We'll cover you." She moved quickly, her hands steady despite the tension in the air. Rourke and the rest of the team formed a perimeter, their weapons trained on the entrance. The growls were getting louder, the sound bouncing off the stone walls and making it impossible to tell how close they were. Diaz finished planting the last charge and gave Rourke a sharp nod. "Ready." "Good," he said. "Now we make some noise." He grabbed a flare from his belt, ignited it, and hurled it into the main chamber. The bright red light illuminated the cavern, casting eerie shadows on the walls. Almost immediately, the warriors appeared, drawn by the sudden burst of light. Kane was at the forefront, his claws glinting in the flare's glow. He let out another roar, and his warriors charged. "Go, go, go!" Rourke shouted, firing into the advancing figures. His team fell back toward the secondary shaft, laying down suppressive fire as they moved. Diaz triggered the first charge, sending a controlled explosion through the tunnel. Rocks rained down, temporarily blocking the path and slowing their pursuers. They reached the secondary shaft just as the first warriors broke through the rubble. Rourke turned, his rifle aimed squarely at Kane, who was barreling toward them like a freight train. He fired, but Kane swatted the bullets away like they were nothing. With a leap, Kane closed the gap, his claws slashing through the air. Rourke ducked, narrowly avoiding the strike, and swung the butt of his rifle into Kane's side. It was like hitting a brick wall. Kane snarled, grabbing the weapon and ripping it from Rourke's hands. Before he could follow through, Diaz stepped in, firing an explosive round that detonated inches from Kane's chest. The force threw him back, giving them just enough time to scramble into the shaft. "Blow it!" Rourke shouted. Diaz didn't hesitate. She hit the detonator, and the remaining charges went off in a deafening series of explosions. The cavern shook violently, the walls cracking and collapsing as tons of rock came crashing down. Dust and debris filled the air, and for a moment, Rourke thought they wouldn't make it, but the secondary shaft held. The team stumbled through the narrow passage, choking on dust and adrenaline. They emerged into the cold night air, battered and bruised but alive. Behind them, the mountain rumbled, a massive plume of dust rising into the sky as the cavern system collapsed. For a moment, there was only silence. Rourke leaned against a tree, his chest heaving. His team was scattered around him, their faces etched with exhaustion and relief. Diaz sat on the ground, her head tilted back as she gulped down deep breaths. "Is it over?" she asked, her voice barely audible. Rourke didn't answer immediately. He stared at the plume of dust, his mind replaying the last few moments in the cavern. Finally, he nodded. "It's over." But even as he said the words, he couldn't shake the lingering unease. Kane's final words echoed in his mind, "We're not the monsters. They are." The debrief at Argent Base was tense. Dr. Voss listened in silence as Rourke recounted the mission, her expression unreadable. When he finished, she folded her hands on the desk and leaned forward. "You disobeyed orders," she said flatly. "I did what had to be done," Rourke shot back. "Those warriors were beyond saving. You knew it, and you sent us in anyway." "They were valuable assets," Voss said, her tone icy. "Do you have any idea what you've cost us?" "They weren't assets," Rourke said, his voice rising. "They were people. And you turned them into monsters." Voss's eyes narrowed. "Careful, Captain. You're treading on dangerous ground." Rourke leaned forward, meeting her gaze. "You want dangerous? How about this? I'm done. I'm filing my report, and then I'm blowing the whistle on this whole operation. The world needs to know what you're doing here." For the first time, Voss's composure cracked. "You'd destroy everything we've worked for? If it means stopping this nightmare?" "Yeah, I would." She didn't respond. Instead, she rose from her chair and walked to the window, her back to him. "You don't understand the stakes," she said quietly. "The world isn't ready for what's out there. This program is our best defense." "Defense against what?" Rourke asked. "Kane and his team were your creation. You're the threat." Voss turned to face him, her expression cold and unreadable. "This conversation is over, Captain." Rourke didn't argue. He stood, saluted out of habit more than respect, and left the room. As he walked down the corridor, he felt a weight lifting off his shoulders. He'd done his part. Now it was time to make sure the truth came out. Weeks later, Rourke sat in a small diner on the outskirts of New Chicago, a cup of black coffee in front of him. He'd sent his report to every major news outlet, along with the classified files he'd smuggled out of Argent Base. The fallout had been immediate and explosive. Protests, investigations, and resignations rippled through the military and government. The Dinosaur Warrior project was officially shut down, but Rourke knew the fight wasn't over. Programs like that didn't just disappear, they went underground, rebranded and repurposed. He'd won this battle, but the war was far from over. As he sipped his coffee, he noticed a figure sitting at the counter, a tall man with sharp features and a faint scar along his jaw. Their eyes met for a brief moment, and Rourke's heart skipped a beat. The man smiled, a cold, knowing smile, and then he was gone, slipping out the door and vanishing into the crowd. Rourke sat frozen, his mind racing. It couldn't be. But deep down, he knew the truth. Kane was still out there.